Okay, so you think Apple makes its money from iPhones, buy the glass rectangle, charge it overnight, watch the billions roll in. It sounds almost embarrassingly simple. The world's most recognizable consumer product, sold at a massive premium to hundreds of millions of people every year. Of course they're rich. You've seen the stores, you've seen the lines, you've seen the keynotes. What else is there to understand? Here's what's strange. Apple sells fewer smartphones than Android. Combined, Android manufacturers ship over a billion units a year compared to Apple's approximately 245 million. Apple isn't the biggest tech employer either. Amazon employs 1.57 million people. Apple employs about 166,000. And here is the part that genuinely breaks people's mental model of how business is supposed to work. Apple doesn't actually build the iPhone. Not the physical assembly, not the chips, not the glass, not the camera sensors. All of that is done by other companies, on other continents, in factories Apple doesn't own. Yet in fiscal year 2025, Apple generated $416 billion in net sales and cleared $112 billion in net income. The answer has almost nothing to do with technology and everything to do with economics. To understand how Apple got here, you need to understand where it almost ended. The company started in a garage in 1976. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Personal computers. The dream of putting computing power into ordinary people's hands. And for a while, it worked. Then, by the mid-1990s, it almost didn't. Apple was burning cash, losing ground to the Windows ecosystem, running a product lineup that nobody inside the company could fully explain, and pushing toward bankruptcy with the kind of speed that makes investors very uncomfortable. The company that had promised to change the world was, by most credible accounts, weeks from disappearing. Then Steve Jobs came back in 1997. What he did next wasn't magic. It was a ruthless rationalization. He cut the product line, he eliminated everything that wasn't essential, he stabilized the cost structure. And then, one by one, he released the devices that redefined entire industries. The iPod in 2001, which effectively digitized music. The iPhone in 2007, which established what a smartphone was supposed to be. The iPad in 2010, which invented the tablet market entirely. These three products turned Apple from an endangered computer manufacturer into the world's most valuable publicly traded company, hitting $1 trillion in market capitalization, then $2 trillion, then 3. The products made Apple famous. But the business model made Apple rich. In a normal competitive market, companies fight along three vectors. They cut prices to capture buyers who are sensitive to cost. They load their products with more features per dollar than the competition. And they push for the widest possible distribution, squeezing every percentage point of market share they can find. Android manufacturers compete almost exactly this way. The result is a highly fragmented product landscape spanned from $30 budget phones to $1,200 flagships, all engaged in a continuous race to offer more for less. And the consequence of that race is predictable. The average hardware profit margin across Android manufacturers sits at approximately 12%. Apple looked at this dynamic and made a different decision. Apple does not compete on price. It does not publish comparison charts of CPU clock speeds. It does not pursue maximum market share as a strategic objective. Instead, Apple competes on a completely different dimension: premium experience, brand identity, ecosystem synergy, and absolute customer loyalty. By controlling both the physical hardware and the proprietary operating system, Apple ensures its devices aren't treated as interchangeable utilities. They're treated as premium portals to a specific, integrated way of living. The practical result of this is one of the most powerful economic conditions a company can engineer. Apple sells value, not specifications. And value, unlike specifications, is almost impossible to price compare. In standard economic theory, there's a concept called price elasticity of demand. It measures how sensitive buyers are to changes in price. When a product is highly elastic, a small price increase causes a significant drop in sales. Consumers substitute for something cheaper. This is the condition most technology hardware operates under. Raise the price, lose the customer. Apple has engineered something different. Its demand is highly inelastic. When Apple raises iPhone prices, the unit sales volume holds. When Apple releases a phone at $930, the average iPhone selling price in 2025, its shipments still grew 10% year over year. The average Android device, by comparison, sells for $370. That pricing gap is not driven by meaningful differences in silicon or camera technology. It's driven by psychology. Here's the mechanism. Apple has positioned the iPhone not as a utilitarian appliance, but as an aspirational product, something that signals taste, belonging, and identity. The price itself becomes a feature. The high price point tells the buyer something about the product before they've even touched it. And cellular carrier financing in major markets converts that $900 sticker price into manageable monthly installments, removing the friction of the upfront cost while leaving Apple's revenue completely intact. When people willingly pay more for the same underlying capability, that's not irrationality. That's brand economics at work. Consider two smartphones, similar processors, comparable cameras, identical display resolution. One sells for $400, one sells for over $900. What is the buyer paying the extra $500 for? The brand, not the logo as a piece of graphic design. The brand as a set of beliefs, feelings, and social signals accumulated over decades of careful engineering of what Apple represents. In economic terms, this is called brand equity, the premium a company can extract above and beyond the cost of the product itself, because consumers have attached meaning to the name on the box that they cannot find elsewhere. Apple's brand equity shows up in places that are measurable. Secondary market pricing is one of them. A flagship Android device typically loses half its value within months of launch and retains somewhere between 25 and 30% of its original retail price after 2 years. An iPhone consistently retains approximately 65% of its value over the same period. That's not a function of the hardware. That's a function of trust, aspiration, and status signaling. The belief that an Apple product is worth owning even after you've owned it for 2 years. This secondary market performance then feeds back into the primary market, because high trade-in values lower the effective cost of upgrading to a new iPhone, which increases upgrade rates, which sustains Apple's revenue cycle. The brand is not just a marketing tool. It is a structural financial asset. Buy an iPhone, then a Mac, then an Apple Watch, then AirPods, then an iPad. At a certain point, you stop evaluating individual products and start experiencing something different. A system. Your watch unlocks your Mac when you walk toward it. Your AirPods switch instantly between your phone and your laptop as you move from room to room. Universal Control lets one keyboard and mouse flow across your Mac and iPad without a single setting to configure. Photos you take on your phone appear on your desktop in seconds. This is ecosystem integration. And it is not accidental. Every product Apple designs is built to increase the utility of every other Apple product a consumer already owns. The more devices you add, the more the whole becomes worth more than the sum of its parts. And this creates an economic condition called a network effect, where the value of belonging to the network increases with each member and each device added to it. The trap, and it is a trap, though a seductive one, is that it works in both directions. Each device you add also makes the thought of leaving more costly. Every new Apple product you own is another thread woven into a fabric that becomes harder to untangle. The question stops being, is this the best product? And starts being, how much would I lose if I stopped? Nobody calls them switching costs, but everyone who has tried to leave Apple's ecosystem has felt them start with the digital assets. Every application you've purchased on iOS is licensed to your Apple ID and cannot be transferred to Android. Every in-app subscription, every game with years of saved progress gone. Then there's the data. If you've stored your photos, messages, and documents in iCloud, migrating that library to a competing cloud infrastructure is time-consuming and carries real risk of data loss. People don't do it. Then there's iMessage. Apple's messaging system uses proprietary encryption that visually distinguishes non-Apple users, the infamous green bubble, and degrades the quality of media sent across platforms. The social pressure to remain in the blue bubble network is informal but real. Add to this the accessories. MagSafe wallets, chargers, watch bands. Apple's accessory ecosystem is built around proprietary or semi-proprietary standards that don't transfer to competing hardware. And finally, there is the behavioral cost. After years on iOS, the thought of relearning an entirely different operating system interface carries its own psychological weight. The cumulative effect of these barriers is an effective customer retention rate of 85 to 88%. Leaving Apple doesn't just mean buying a different phone. It carries an intense hidden transaction cost that most users calculate, consciously or not, and decide isn't worth paying. Here is one of the most instructive facts about Apple's business model. The company that makes one of the most profitable consumer products in history does not own a single major assembly plant. The physical production of an iPhone is distributed across a network of contract manufacturers and component suppliers. Foxconn and Pegatron handle final assembly, primarily in China. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, fabricates the proprietary Apple silicon chips. Samsung and LG Display supply the OLED panels. Sony manufactures the camera sensors. Corning produces the specialized structural glass. What Apple actually does is control the things that determine the value of the product: industrial design, silicon architecture, software development, retail strategy, and brand management. It designs the chip. It writes the operating system. It determines how the product looks, feels, and functions. Then it hands those specifications to a network of manufacturers who compete aggressively for Apple's business and execute the physical production. This is called asset-light economics. By avoiding the depreciation of factory assets, direct labor liabilities, and the enormous capital expenditures of operating global manufacturing facilities, Apple keeps its balance sheet lean and its return on assets exceptionally high. The manufacturing complexity sits on someone else's books. The intellectual value, the part that commands the premium, sits entirely with Apple. When Tim Cook joined Apple as chief operating officer in 1998, he found $400 million of excess inventory sitting in warehouses, losing 1 to 2% of its value every single week. Cook had one observation about inventory that shaped everything that followed. He called it fundamentally evil. Treat components like milk, something that must move fast because it spoils. What he did next was systematic. He cut primary component suppliers from over 100 down to 24, forcing vendors to compete for Apple's volume. He closed 10 of the company's 19 global warehouses. Within 7 months, inventory days on hand dropped from 30 to 6. By 1999, it was 2 days. By 2025, Apple's just-in-time manufacturing system maintained an average inventory holding of 5 to 12 days, far outpacing competitors like Samsung, but the mastery goes beyond efficiency. Apple uses its cash reserves as a strategic weapon. In 2005, it prepaid $1.25 billion to flash memory suppliers, securing near-exclusive access to global NAND flash memory capacity and locking competitors out of the MP3 market for years. It also purchases proprietary manufacturing machinery and leases it directly to suppliers, gaining exclusive production techniques while keeping those assets off its own balance sheet. Scale, speed, and strategic pre-commitment. This is how Apple turns purchasing power into competitive advantage. Most people, when they think about Apple's revenue, think about iPhones. They are not wrong. Hardware remains significant. But what has changed the financial architecture of Apple is something less visible and far more lucrative: services. The App Store, iCloud, Apple Music, Apple TV Plus, Apple Pay, Apple Care. Advertising, licensing. These products don't require factories. They don't require shipping logistics. They don't require inventory management. They are digital. And once built, they generate recurring revenue with minimal incremental cost. In fiscal year 2025, Apple's services segment generated $109.2 billion in revenue, more than 26% of Apple's total corporate revenue. And here is the number that changes everything. While Apple's hardware products ran at a gross margin of 36.8% in FY 2025, the services segment ran at a gross margin of 75.4%. Think about what that means structurally. Every dollar of services revenue that Apple adds generates roughly twice the gross profit of a dollar of iPhone revenue. As the services segment grows as a share of Apple's total mix, the company's overall profitability expands automatically, without shipping a single additional device. Hardware upgrade cycles are slowing globally as smartphones mature. Services revenue does not slow, it compounds. The App Store is one of the most efficient business models ever designed. Apple built the platform, wrote the rules, and enforces security standards. Then millions of independent developers, who fund their own development costs, built applications that make the platform more valuable. Apple takes a commission of 15 to 30% on every digital download, every in-app purchase, and every digital subscription that passes through its marketplace. In 2025, App Store consumer spending is projected to reach $142 billion. Apple's cut of that is substantial, high margin, and almost entirely passive. The developers did the work. Apple collects the toll. This is platform economics in its purest form. The App Store operates as a two-sided marketplace connecting developers with iOS users, and Apple's role is that of a platform regulator, setting the conditions under which both sides interact and extracting a percentage of every transaction. Every new developer who builds for iOS makes the iPhone more valuable to the next buyer. Every new buyer makes the platform more attractive to the next developer. The flywheel is self-reinforcing, and Apple doesn't have to fund a single line of external code to benefit from it. There is something you will almost never see Apple do: put an iPhone on sale. For most consumer electronics companies, discounting is a routine part of managing inventory and stimulating demand. Drop the price 15%, move more units, clear the pipeline for the next model. It feels pragmatic, but it carries a hidden cost that traditional retailers consistently underestimate. Discounting damages brand perception. The moment a company signals its product is worth less than the tag price, it opens a question in every buyer's mind. When will this go on sale again? The customer who pays full price on day one feels penalized. The customer who waits learns that waiting is smart. Over time, this erodes the premium positioning that justified the price in the first place. Compressing margins and setting expectations that are extraordinarily difficult to reverse, Apple's solution is price rigidity. The retail price of an iPhone or iPad remains stable throughout its primary lifecycle, from launch day until the moment its successor is announced. When older models need to be cleared, Apple doesn't slash prices on the floor. It quietly transitions them to lower price tiers, routes inventory through secondary carriers, or channels devices into its certified refurbished program. The perceived scarcity this creates is real. When you know the price won't drop, the decision calculus changes entirely. Apple does something in its advertising that almost no other technology company attempts. It almost never mentions specifications. Open a standard technology advertisement from any major Android manufacturer, and you'll find processor benchmarks, megapixel counts, battery life comparisons, and charts showing why their product is superior to the competition. It's a rational appeal to a rational buyer. Apple's approach is something else entirely. Apple's marketing campaigns show what it feels like to use the device. People filming their children at golden hour, musicians recording in their living rooms, photographers capturing images that look like they belong in a gallery. The device appears almost incidentally. It's the experience that occupies the frame. The brand communicates aspiration, creative identity, and personal empowerment. There is no comparison chart. There is no competitor mentioned. This approach does two things simultaneously. It avoids commoditization. There's no specification you can point to and say, this Android does it cheaper. And it cultivates a buyer who isn't purchasing a phone. They're purchasing an identity. That's not a cynical observation. It's why Apple's marketing is studied in business schools. It sells aspiration, and aspiration is extraordinarily difficult to price. The Apple Store is not a store. That sounds like a piece of marketing language, but it is accurate in an economic sense. A traditional retail store is designed to move inventory efficiently, units in, units sold, repeat. An Apple Store is designed to do something different. It is an experiential brand showcase, a service center, and a community space that happens to also sell products. The physical design is deliberate, world-renowned architects, open layouts, communal tables where customers are encouraged to spend time with devices rather than be hurried toward a checkout counter. The Genius Bar, now called Genius Support, provides face-to-face technical assistance, which builds a form of trust and loyalty that no customer service phone line can replicate. The store itself is a brand argument built of glass and stone that says, this company takes its products seriously enough to house them in spaces that cost more per square foot to build than almost any other retailer on Earth. The economic output of this strategy is measurable. Apple stores generate some of the highest sales per square foot in the entire global retail industry. But the revenue figure alone misses the strategic point. These stores exist not primarily to sell product. They exist to deepen customer engagement, build loyalty, and reinforce the premium positioning that makes the pricing model work. They are part of the brand. Just installed in a building, in fiscal year 2025, Apple generated $111.5 billion in operating cash flow. It ended the year with $132.4 billion in cash, cash equivalents, and marketable securities. These are numbers that make institutional investors behave in a specific way. They don't want to sell. The reason is predictability. Apple's revenue mix, stable hardware supplemented by rapidly growing, high-margin services, creates an earnings profile that is significantly more resilient to macroeconomic shocks than most technology companies. When consumers pull back on discretionary spending, Apple's installed base of active devices keeps generating services revenue. When hardware upgrade cycles slow, the services flywheel keeps turning. The business doesn't need the economy to be booming to produce consistent free cash flow. Apple's capital return program amplifies this attractiveness. In FY 2025 alone, Apple deployed $89.3 billion to repurchase its own common stock, supported by a newly authorized $100 billion buyback allocation. Since initiating its repurchase program in 2013, Apple has spent over $841 billion on buybacks, retiring more than 44% of its outstanding shares. Each share repurchased at a reasonable valuation mechanically increases the earnings per share of every remaining shareholder without requiring them to invest another dollar. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway has held Apple as its top public equity position for years. That is a meaningful signal. Buffett doesn't invest in technology. He invests in durable economic moats and predictable cash generation, and Apple, in his analysis, is both. No business model is permanent, and Apple's has structural vulnerabilities worth naming precisely. The most immediate is regulatory. In March 2024, the Department of Justice filed a smartphone monopoly lawsuit targeting Apple's platform lock-in, specifically the iMessage ecosystem and the restrictions on watchOS. A district judge denied Apple's motion to dismiss in June 2025, advancing the case toward trial. Simultaneously, the European Union's Digital Markets Act forced Apple to support alternative app stores and linkouts from its own platform. Changes Apple has partially resisted while introducing new fee structures to replace the old ones. Geopolitics is the second risk. Apple's manufacturing base is disproportionately concentrated in China. Trade tariffs, geopolitical friction, or regulatory changes in China's manufacturing environment could disrupt supply chain in ways that are difficult to absorb quickly. Apple is pursuing a China Plus One strategy, accelerating manufacturing in Vietnam and India, but this diversification takes years, not quarters. Regional competition is intensifying. Huawei's Harmony OS reached a 19% market share in China in the first quarter of 2026, creating direct pressure on Apple's position in one of its largest markets. And then there is the innovation question. Apple's current dominance rests partly on ecosystem lock-in, on the stickiness it has built over 15 years of compounding switching costs. But ecosystems can be disrupted. The history of technology is, in significant part, the history of dominant ecosystems that seemed permanent until they weren't. Competitors have been trying to replicate Apple's model for nearly 2 decades. They have largely failed to replicate its margins. Here's why. The things that are easy to copy are not the things that matter. Hardware specifications can be matched, industrial design can be approximated, software features can be duplicated, often within months of Apple releasing them. These are the visible surface layer of what Apple does. What cannot be easily replicated is the infrastructure underneath. Brand equity is not designed. It is accumulated over decades through consistent delivery, careful marketing, and the compounding effect of millions of customers having positive experiences that they then recommend to other people. Trust is not purchased. It is earned, and it erodes faster than it is built. Status signaling only functions when the signal is widely understood, and that requires cultural penetration that takes time, money, and luck to achieve. The ecosystem is perhaps the hardest thing to replicate. Apple's ecosystem works because every device was designed by the same company, running the same operating system, optimized to communicate with every other device in the same family. A competitor cannot create this overnight. It requires an existing installed base before the network effects can operate. You need the installed base to build the moat, and you need the moat to grow the installed base. In economics, this is called a durable competitive advantage, an economic moat. It takes years of capital, operational discipline, and relentless brand stewardship to construct. And in Apple's case, it took something else too. A near-death experience that clarified exactly what the company was supposed to be. Here's what Apple actually built. It's not a phone company. It's not a software company. It's not, despite what its retail stores might suggest, a lifestyle brand in the conventional sense. What Apple built is a closed economic system, a platform economy that converts an initial hardware purchase into a decades-long revenue relationship, compounded at every stage by services, accessories, loyalty, and switching costs so deeply embedded that most users don't consciously calculate them. The iPhone is the entry point. It is not the business. The business is the ecosystem that the iPhone unlocks, the App Store toll booth that every transaction passes through, the iCloud subscription that quietly renews every month, the Apple Watch that requires an iPhone to function, the AirPods that switch seamlessly between your devices but nowhere else, the trade-in value that makes the next upgrade feel affordable, and the Genius Bar appointment that builds the kind of trust a competitor cannot buy with a feature comparison sheet. The financial architecture that sits underneath all of this is equally distinctive. By outsourcing manufacturing to a globally optimized supply chain while retaining full control of design, software, and silicon, Apple captures the high-margin intellectual layer of the value chain while leaving the capital-intensive, lower-margin physical layer to its suppliers. Its services business generates gross margins of over 75%, more than double what the hardware business produces. Its cash generation is so consistent and so large that it spends nearly $90 billion per year simply buying back its own stock. This is not an accident of product genius. It is the result of deliberate, sustained strategic choices made across branding, pricing, supply chain, platform economics, and capital allocation. Each one reinforcing the others, each one making the next iteration of the model more defensible than the last. The antitrust pressure is real. The China exposure is real. The regulatory friction in Europe is real. These are genuine fault lines, and no company navigates them without cost. But Apple's fundamental architecture, brand equity, ecosystem lock-in, asset-light manufacturing, and high-margin recurring services, represents a business model that is studied precisely because it's so difficult to dismantle. So the next time you see that logo, remember what you're actually looking at. Not a phone, not a computer, not a watch, A business system that converts a customer's first device purchase into a recurring, compounding, deeply sticky economic relationship. One designed at every level to never let them leave. The real product Apple sells isn't an iPhone. It's a business system that keeps customers coming back. And that's why its economics are studied around the world.